Welcome to this week's lecture on stakeholder analysis. Stakeholder analysis is an incredibly powerful tool in helping us to identify exactly how we should be making our strategic plans. But it's also one that, because it can actually be quite simple to understand the basics, too many people do not move beyond the basics. Therefore, it's very important that you have a good practice at implementing this and not just at trying it. It's also important to recognize that many of the initial responses to stakeholder analysis will be wrong. Certainly there are a lot of people who may be very powerful, but who it is actually very important to actually keep uninterested. You don't necessarily want powerful people interested in your project, and therefore it's important to look at that. And we'll look focus on something like the dormant stakeholder, and sometimes it can be good to keep them dormant. And actually what to do about stakeholders who are perhaps interested but not powerful. Is it possible to actually make stakeholders who maybe have your interests at heart more powerful? And we'll look at ways perhaps of unifying them or bringing them together into collective organisations which can imbue them with a power they don't have on an individual basis. So what we're trying to do out of this and the series of lectures that I've downloaded from the internet for you, well, we're going to sort of define a stakeholder, be absolutely clear about what it is. It is someone who has a role and an interest in what you do and is able to actually influence it. But be very careful. At first, when producing a list of stakeholders, it's very important to actually produce as big a list as possible, and then whittle it down. Start from the long list and whittle it down to those when you realise those who actually have no role. It's also important to look at whether they're internal to your organisation or external, which can make a difference in the way you relate to them. The accurate appraisal of stakeholder levels of power and interest is very difficult. It is far too easy to think everybody who's powerful must be interested, and everybody who's interested must be powerful. This is simply not true. And the whole point, of course, of understanding what the levels of power of interest are is in reality to be able to realign them, to bring forward those stakeholders you think should be interested, who could help you, and to push back those whose power you're not that interested in. So stakeholders are groups, internal and external, have expectations and potential influence upon you. They can include suppliers and distributors in a corporate sense. They are the shareholders, the employees, the local communities, anyone who can be affected by what you're doing but have an effect on it as well. It can include people from policymakers, regulators, government agencies. These can be the people who are powerful and who you may want to have an interest at certain places. Perhaps you want them to make policy that's useful for you. Perhaps you want them at certain points to make changes that are helpful for you. But a lot of the time, actually, your main interest in these people is actually to keep them at arm's length. And how you decide to do that can be part of your important strategic planning. So standard agencies, owners of competitive technologies can also be stakeholders in you, and in fact they can be affected by you, and what they do influences you. It's also important to remember that the public sector stakeholders, there is a special influence there in that there can be conflicts between various different members of the public sector and different ways they can expect you. So for instance, an obvious one is taxpayers want low taxes, but service users expect high levels of service, and it's quite often that this can be the same people. And one sector saying we don't want to pay very tax, and the other said they will have personal demands for service use. They can also be different people. And the absolute classic example of this was recently I was listening to an Australian MP who had been elected independent and held the balance of power in Australian Parliament and was being courted by both major parties in order to enable him to form a government. And he had three simple demands. He's a rural MP, subsidies for rural broadband, subsidies for rural transport, and low taxes. If you're going to have low taxes, how do you pay for large subsidies? The question is that actually within the same person that there was a conflict. Equally, trade unions can actually demand that the workers get regulated hours of work, but service users these days often have great expectations of extended opening hours, etc. And the government is obviously, at the moment, we see the government pushing that. We see this big conflict in the NHS, where your junior doctors are being pushed to do what they consider to be an unsafe contract. And I would agree with them. I think it is an unsafe contract. But the government is saying it's necessary to have a 7-day NHS. With professional bodies guidelines, it can actually set certain rules and ways of behaving in order to make sure that people are professional. So you see this within accounting firms, etc. But yet again, managements in the public sector can hoping to have much more flexible working arrangements to reduce costs and have people available when it's most required, it's best. So these can go very much into contradiction. The government itself can impose efficiency savings. If a local community can desire to maintain services, these two can also regularly be in conflict. And one example of this is the charities often advertise about how little money they spend on administration, but an organisation spending too little on administration opens itself up to problems in which it might actually not be administrated properly. In the case of a charity, this can be very, very difficult. People who are contributing money to the charity expect the charity to raise money and to expect charity to make payments. Okay, what we're actually looking for here, of course, is to combine level of interest and power. And this gives us 4 areas of the matrix. Those with low interest and low power, we will make a minimal effort to. Some people, and some of the lecturers I said will argue that these are people who should be ignored. But of course, the reality is their interest can change, especially if you or someone else unifies them and brings people who might have a disparate interest together. Supposed to be about keeping informed. Again, these people have high interest and therefore they might have low power. You might actually probably want them to actually stay in this position. Again, you don't want them to start to think about how they might organise themselves. So therefore, it's all to keep informed. You'll see this in the public sector with that idea of briefings and newsletters and emails around them. You can also see more interesting ways we'll see later on. Look at the model. Those of low interest and high power can definitely keep satisfied. Very important. Remember, you're trying to keep them satisfied because at the moment, the idea of keep satisfied is that you don't want them on many occasions to be interfering. So you're actually trying to keep them satisfied to stop them taking lower interest. This will certainly be true about senior politicians, higher levels of government, regulators, all these sort of people you don't really want to get involved. And then you have your key players. These are the ones that you actually want that have both high power and high interest. On the whole, you hope to actually get ones that are the same sort of ideas as you, but you cannot always guarantee that. So you have to learn to deal with whoever it is that's put on in front of you. But your main idea is often to try and keep people who are key players but who actually are not in agreement with you, maybe to try and move them into low levels of interest, and therefore you can keep them satisfied to keep them there. Questions you have to ask yourself when you're doing stakeholder mapping. Do actual levels of interest and power reflect governance frameworks? Do you need to adjust your framework to actually accurately represent this? Is this correct? Do that. I mean, the reality is a lot of it will depend on where you're sat, and it'll depend on how it affects you. So two different people, two different organisations involved in the same thing may well have different ideas of what interest and power are related about the groups around them. You're also often looking at who can block a strategy. The blockers are people who you want to lower their interest. Facilitators, those who can help you build up a strategy. These are ones who you want to boost their interest. You want to move them into high interest if the sort of people can help you get on with it. It can also be the same person. It may well be that but certainly with national politicians or suppliers of funding, once you've got them on board and they've been interested, they've provided money, you may want to just keep them informed, make sure their day-to-day interest falls away so that you can get on with doing the things the way you want them to do them. You should look at repositioning. Like I said, there are some stakeholders you may want to move a lot. It may also be that you need other groups of stakeholders. The absolute classic is to mobilise groups sometimes. And you see this a lot with sort of astroturfing, when organisations try and put people together to work on projects, trying to put pressure on others. If you've got something you want doing and you can't get the pressure to get people to do it, then maybe you can get people of low interest but maybe of slightly high power, or people of low power, high interest, and you can mobilise them to get organised. So maybe get a community group formed or a union formed where people actually work together, and this can give them an opportunity to actually gain higher power. And maybe they've got high interest, once they get higher power, maybe they can start to bring influence for you on your behalf. So therefore you're looking around and trying to pick out which of the key stakeholders of power you have to maintain. Bear in mind that they are not necessarily, you don't just have to accept where they are and just say, oh, this is the act of God where they stand. It can well be that there may be things that you can change, that you can get made differently, that will help you in this area. Again, in the public sector, you're very different. Many of you hopefully will be, when you become public sector managed by things, you'll believe actually in participating in democracy. The idea is that you can work together and get external, internal stakeholders asking for their opinions, getting them there, developing the vision of the organisation of the future. They're very much the image of the stakeholders, the idea of the stakeholders should go into a mission and vision if you want to get them to buy into it. So you should be constantly adapting these in lines with your stakeholders. And this is obviously something that is, again, especially in the relationship, because you have so many different people. occupying different areas in the sort of public sector. You can try and bring opinion leaders together, representative user groups, all these sort of pressure groups, etc. You can develop them, support them. Perhaps if you can push them and direct them in the direction in which you wish to go, it can give a very powerful impetus to your strategy. If this is participatory democratic approach, though, many of the other people have argued that actually the general material that's often put about that you should disregarding applying minimum effort to those group of stakeholders who lack power. In fact, there will be times when actually your policies will be to increase some stakeholders' influence of power on minimize the others. You may actually want to take those who are already powerless and boost their abilities to push them forward. Stakeholder theory is often actually criticised on the other side as well, though. That the reality is stakeholder idea of negotiating some sort of compromise between different groups, whereas the reality is there will be times when you cannot do that, and therefore it will be a matter of policy, a matter of strategy to select those groups that you think are best in line with you and try and promote those groups, and that other groups that actually you may actually find, well, actually they disagree with us. It's not. And there's often people as the stakeholders say, well, what we're supposed to do is do something to make them satisfied. Actually, maybe it's actually the opposite, that sometimes a stakeholder feels, well, these people are stakeholders. We need to remove them. We need to lower their interest. We need to make sure that they can't affect us anymore. So it's really important to deal with that as an issue. Like I said, I'm going to give you an example now, and which is based around the idea of some work that's looked at the City of God and Levitt Subner in Free Economics and in a rogue sociologist, which dealt with many of these issues.